She ran into the storm barefoot, breathless, clutching the journal that betrayed her heart. Wind tore at her dress. Rain lashed her skin. Behind her he came, Elias Rowe, the man who hadn't spoken of love in years. He didn't call her name at first. He just ran, with a rifle slung across his back and terror in his chest. Terror not of the storm, but of losing her. And when he found her, curled beneath a fallen log, shaking, soaked, and face to face with a starving wolf, he didn't think. He fired. Then the silence returned, until she looked up at him, tears mixing with rain, and whispered, "I couldn't stop loving you." What he said next would change everything. This wasn't rescue. This was the breaking point where silence became love. The snow had come early that year, smothering the valley in silence. Winds swept across the bluffs like a low morning song, threading between pines and tugging at the hem of memory. Elias Rowe didn't mind the cold. It reminded him that he was still alive. Barely. Enough. He rode slow along the edge of the gulch, the reins loose in his fingers, a rifle slung across his back more from habit than purpose. He hadn't spoken to another soul in days, maybe weeks. That was fine. Words didn't fix the things broken in him. The storm hadn't fully let up. Snow drifted down in slow spirals, soft but heavy. And that's when he saw it. A shape near a twisted juniper tree. Two shapes, actually. One curled into the other. At first he thought it was a deer shielding its fawn. But the stillness was too human. He dismounted, boots crunching into frost-crusted soil. One hand dropped instinctively to the knife at his belt, but nothing moved. Not at first. Then the smaller shape shifted, just barely. A twitch of fingers. He stepped closer. The woman was dead. That much was clear. Her body was stiff, her mouth parted slightly, eyes sunken beneath lids that hadn't closed fully. Her arm was wrapped around the girl beside her, no older than 14, maybe younger, the way mothers try to protect their children, even in the final breath. The girl didn't speak. She barely breathed. Frost clung to her lashes like silver dust. Her feet were bare, red with cold, the skin cracked and raw, but her eyes, hollow as they were, still searched his. He knelt beside her. "Hey," he said, voice low, unused. It cracked like ice. She blinked, slowly, like it hurt, then tried to speak. Nothing came out. Her lips parted again. "She won't wake up," she whispered. Ilias looked at the woman again. Dead maybe a day, 2 at most. Fever had left her slick with old sweat now frozen to her skin. He exhaled, hard. He could ride into town. Tell someone. Let someone else deal with the girl. The body. The cold. She wasn't his responsibility, but when he looked into the girl's eyes, he was no longer in the valley. He was back in a one-room house with a dirt floor, watching his little sister Clara die from smallpox, his mother's voice fading into quiet, his father's boots walking out the door and never coming back, his jaw clenched. Elias stood and pulled a small object from his saddlebag, a wooden bird, carved long ago for a grave that never had a marker. He placed it gently in the dead woman's hands. Then he dug. The ground was hard, frozen, his fingers cracked, his knees ached. But he worked until the hole was wide enough, deep enough, quiet enough. He wrapped the woman's body in her shawl and placed her in the earth with a reverence no preacher could improve. He crossed himself, though the gesture felt foreign now. Then turned to the girl. "Come on!" She didn't move. "I ain't asking again." He scooped her up. She was light, too light, like a sack of bones wrapped in stubborn breath. She clutched something in her hand, a ragged doll with no face left, its yarn hair worn smooth. Her head fell against his shoulder. For the first time since he'd found her, her eyes closed. He carried her to the horse, lifted her into the saddle, mounted behind her, and wrapped his coat around them both. They rode slow through the falling snow. No words, just breath. He didn't know how to save her, but he knew how not to walk away. The blizzard never truly ended. It just grew tired. The wind settled into long sighs, and the snow stopped falling like a scream and started drifting like dust. In that gray stillness, Elias Rowe made room for a stranger beneath his roof. He didn't move her into the cabin, not at first. Instead, he built a shelter beside it, pieced together from spare lumber, canvas tarps, and strips of burlap feed sacks. It wasn't much. 4 uneven walls, a cot made from hay bales and an old wool blanket, but it stood against the wind. That was enough. Ashen Mira never complained, never asked questions. She simply existed, quietly. She moved through the snow like smoke, thin and soundless, eyes always watching. When Elias chopped wood, she stood nearby, hugging her knees. When he fed the cattle, she followed a few paces behind, trailing his footprints like she was afraid they might vanish if she looked away. She didn't speak for days, but she listened, closely, and slowly she began to copy. She brought in firewood before he asked. She cleaned his tin cup with melted snow and set it beside the basin. One morning the axe was already sharpened when he reached for it. She never sought praise, just did. At night, Elias would hear a soft scraping sound from the lean-to. Not a rat, not wind. He knew better. It was her pencil, dragging across paper. She'd found a leather-bound journal in the bottom of her mother's satchel. The pages were yellowed, the cover cracked, but it had survived, like her. He pictured her curled under blankets, candle flickering beside her, pouring out whatever storm she kept behind those eyes. He never asked what she wrote. Some things deserved to remain hers. Occasionally, traders passed through with crates of dried fruit and tobacco. Elias bartered in silence, but he caught the way their eyes lingered too long on Ashen. One spat near the steps and muttered, "She your blood?" Another, bolder, asked if Elias had papers to prove who she was. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just stared until they rode off into the cold. Still, the rumors spread. Not his kin, not his wife. He's hiding something. But Elias kept splitting logs, kept boiling stew for 2, kept setting out that second spoon like it had always been there. Ashen Mira never asked why he kept her. She just stayed. She sewed herself mittens from old saddle leather and lined her coat with scrap flannel. The boots she wore were his, cut down, reshaped with twine and wool. He left them by the fire one morning. She put them on without a word. Their days moved like the creek beneath the ice. Silent, slow, but sure. In time, she began to hum when she stirred the stew. She tapped her fingers softly on the table when it rained. And one morning, Elias caught her standing barefoot on the porch, face tilted to the sun. She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch from the light either. In a world where men are judged by how loud they speak, Elias Rowe loved in silence, through stitched boots, firewood stacks, and a second bowl never needing to be explained. By the time the snow began to melt, something deeper than survival had taken root. They hadn't spoken of it. They didn't need to, because sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it just stays. By the end of spring, Ashen Mira was 17. It didn't come with celebration, no cake, no candles, no marker but time itself. But something had changed. She moved with intention now, still soft, but steadier. She carried water without spilling. She swept the cabin with care, not just efficiency. Her eyes, once hollow from cold, now held something Elias Rowe couldn't name. Not quite light, not quite fire, but it unsettled him all the same. She had grown, not just in height, though she stood straighter, taller, but in the way she took up space. Quietly, completely. And Elias noticed. He noticed the way her braid fell lower down her back, the way she laughed softly when she dropped flour on the floor, then swept it up before he could say anything, the way she watched him longer than she used to. He avoided her gaze, not out of guilt, but fear, not of her, of what he might feel, of what she might begin to feel in return. He took longer routes around the pasture now, spent more time repairing fences that didn't need mending. When she lingered near the stove while he brewed coffee, he found excuses to go outside, but their silences had started to ache. One morning after mending a fence post, Elias returned to the cabin and found something folded neatly on his cot, his shirt, his old red flannel, cleaned, patched, sewn tighter to fit his frame. The buttons had been replaced with polished shell, stitched with delicate red thread. The collar had been reshaped, not perfect, but earnest. He stared at it for a long time. Then he put it on. He wore it the next day while mending the corral fence. Didn't mention it, didn't look at her. But when he walked past the porch, he caught her watching, cheeks flushed, hands curled around her skirt. She looked away quickly. He didn't. The days moved forward like that, deliberate, fragile. When her hand brushed his while passing a tin cup, his fingers flinched. When her shoulder leaned too close by the fire, he stood and stirred the pot longer than needed. But the gap between them was shrinking, and he felt it. Then came the accident. The steer had been acting up, horns sharp, eyes wild from heat and flies. Elias tried to wrangle it into a smaller pen, rope tight in his calloused hands. One snap, one wrong twist, and the beast lunged. The horn caught him in the ribs, sent him hard to the ground. Ashen saw it all. She ran, faster than he'd ever seen her move, dropping her sewing as she crossed the yard. "Elias!" she cried. He groaned once but didn't rise. She dropped to her knees beside him, mud soaking her skirt, hands trembling as she reached for his shirt, blood already blooming through the fabric. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He tried to sit up, failed. She pressed a cloth to the wound, dabbed his brow, smoothed his hair back with trembling fingers. "Stay still," she breathed. His eyes fluttered open, found her, locked. And in that moment, something passed between them, not new but no longer hidden. His hand reached up, found hers. She didn't let go, not then, not for a long time. It wasn't the pain in his ribs that broke him open. It was her touch, quiet, certain, and unafraid. The days after the accident passed in silence, but something between them had shifted. Ash and Mira stayed close, not hovering, but present. She brought him broth without asking. Lit the fire earlier, rewrapped his ribs when he wouldn't. Elias didn't stop her, but he also didn't meet her eyes. Not often, not for long. He'd built his life around restraint, walls thick with silence. But now those walls had begun to hum, like something inside them wanted out. One gray morning, while Ashen was out in the grove gathering kindling, Elias went to tidy her lean-to. She hadn't slept there in weeks, not since the fever months ago. Still, he returned out of habit, clearing dust and shaking out the blankets. That's when he found it. The journal. Leather-bound, worn at the edges, a single pressed flower marking a page. He hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting was small and slanted, the ink faded in places, but the words struck with a clarity he wasn't ready for. He is not my father. He is not my savior. He is the only dream I've dared to hold. Elias stopped breathing. He flipped to another page, then another. If I kissed him, would he turn away? If I ran, would he come after me? The words were raw, private, beautiful, and they undid him. He hadn't meant to read more, but his hands moved before his mind could say no. Rage rose, not at her, but at himself, for pretending he didn't see what was growing in the space between them, for building fences where there should have been truth. When Ashen returned, arms full of firewood, he was sitting by the fire, the journal open in his lap. She froze. He looked up, jaw tight. "Where were you keeping this?" Her eyes darted to the journal. "Under the mattress," she whispered. "You meant it, every word." Ashen stepped forward, then stopped. Her voice shook. "They weren't for you to see." "I know," he said, "but I did." Silence pulsed between them. And then, without another word, she turned and fled, out the door, into the storm that had begun to gather along the ridgeline. Wind howled through the trees as the first flake of snow touched the porch rail. "Damn it," Elias muttered, grabbing his coat, his rifle, and a lantern. He ran into the growing blizzard, calling her name, over and over, until his voice cracked. "Ashen!" The storm didn't answer. The world turned white, wind clawing at his face, mud sucking at his boots. Branches whipped his arms. Lightning forked across the distant hills. Then, just ahead, a flicker. Her lamp was out, but she still clutched the glass. She sat beneath a fallen tree, soaked through, shivering violently. Her journal lay half-buried beside her in the snow. But she wasn't alone. A wolf, thin, desperate, teeth bared, stalked just feet away. Elias raised his rifle. One shot. The animal yelped and vanished into the trees. Ashen flinched, eyes wild, then locked on him. Locked on. He dropped to his knees, breath ragged. She burst into tears. "I didn't mean to love you," she gasped. I just, I couldn't stop." He pulled her into his arms, wrapping his coat around her trembling frame. "You weren't meant to save me," he whispered into her hair. "But you did, and now I don't know how to live without you." She sobbed against his chest, clutching his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her from shattering. They didn't speak again as he carried her home. They didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken. Ash and Mira never went back to the lean-to. After the storm, Elias didn't speak of the journal again. He didn't need to. That night had carved something into both of them. Deep, wordless, and irreversible. She moved her few belongings into his cabin without fanfare. No vows were spoken, no questions asked. One morning, her boots sat beside his. By the next, her shawl hung on the hook by the stove. Their life together unfolded in gestures. Quiet, deliberate, real. They shared chores. Elias chopped, she stacked. He hunted, she cooked. He carved wooden spoons, and she painted them with flowers in the afternoons, humming tunes he didn't recognize. By the riverbank, they planted herbs in shallow clay pots. Lavender, rosemary, mint. Ashen knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled, eyes soft. Elias built her a low bench from old fence posts. Sometimes children from nearby farms wandered by, scrappy, sunburnt, curious. Ashen welcomed them with warm bread and lessons in the dirt. She drew letters with her finger in flour scattered on the table. The children traced them with wide eyes. E is for elk, she'd say. R is for river. T is for truth. Elias watched from the doorway, arms crossed, hiding a smile. He'd never seen anything so sacred. One clear afternoon, a rider approached. Sheriff Tom Delaney, a man of stiff shoulders, tight mouth, and a badge that weighed more than his soul could carry. He dismounted slow, knocked once on the open doorframe. Elias answered, calm but stone-faced. The sheriff tipped his hat toward Ashen, who was washing clothes in a basin by the window. "She your wife?" Elias didn't answer right away. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "Or your kin, then? Got papers?" Ashen turned, water dripping from her hands. Elias stepped forward, voice steady. "She bakes better than any woman in town," he said. "She teaches children to read by firelight. She fixed this place with her hands and filled it with laughter again. If the law can't see that, maybe the law's gone blind." The sheriff looked between them. "Folks are talking." "Let them," Elias said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move from the door. After a long pause, the sheriff nodded once. "Then I reckon I've heard all I need." He rode off into the dust. Ashen exhaled. Later that evening, they sat on the porch together as fireflies blinked along the grass. Ashen cradled a carved mug of tea. Elias was whittling again, something round and small, a toy for one of the neighbor's children. Neither spoke of the sheriff. They didn't need to. The bond they'd made wasn't inked or notarized. It was lived in shared bread, in laughter, in bruised hands and quiet nights. They didn't need a paper to prove what they were. Some people signed their names to a ledger. Elias and Ashen signed theirs to the land, to the silence between words and the mornings they chose each other all over again. No preacher had blessed them. No church had housed them. But their home had held when everything else had fallen. And that was enough. The river behind the cabin never froze. Not fully, not even in the dead of winter. It murmured its way through mossy rocks and old roots, a living thread that bound their land like a vein. Elias Rowe came to it often, sometimes to think, sometimes to forget. But on this morning he came to remember. He carried a chisel in one hand, a small mallet in the other. A stone, flat, oval, and smooth as a child's palm, waited for him near the water's edge. He knelt, knees cracking, and began to carve. The words were slow to form, not because he didn't know what to say, but because it had taken him a lifetime to say them at all. The letters weren't perfect, but they were deep, permanent, honest. When Ashen found him hours later, his hands were stained with dust, and the sun was already slipping behind the trees. She knelt beside him, ran her fingers over the carved words. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded once. "Didn't need a gravestone, just a truth that lasts." She smiled, rested her head against his shoulder. "We're not gone yet." "Not yet," he said, voice warm and scratchy. They lived quietly but not hidden. Ashen taught every child that wandered too far from home. She used flour, sticks, river rocks, anything to make letters feel like play instead of burden. Sometimes they practiced on the porch, sometimes in the grass, sometimes in the dirt with their fingers. Elias carved spoons and toys and little animals, birds with open wings, horses with curled tails, rabbits with bent ears. Some he gave away. Some he tucked into Ashen's satchel like secret blessings. Evenings were spent by the fire. Sometimes she sang. Sometimes he tried to follow along. Always they ended with him looking at her like the sun had remembered how to rise. Years passed, and still they had no rings, no priest, no stamped papers to prove anything. But their cabin became a place people spoke about in hushed awe. "She never leaves," the townsfolk said. "He built her a garden from nothing. She teaches the wild kids no one else will touch. They're odd but real. You feel it, don't you?" One autumn afternoon, Elias asked her the question that had long sat silent between them. "You ever wish we'd done it proper?" Ashen looked at him from the other side of their porch, her fingers wrapped around a clay mug of mint tea. The steam curled like a question between them. She stood, crossed the space, took his hand and placed it on her heart. "This is proper," she said. "No vows, no judge, just you, just me, and a home that held when everything else broke." He said nothing, but the way he held her hand tighter told her everything. They grew old like trees, weathered but rooted. Children became adults and returned with their own children. The porch remained the classroom, the river their sanctuary, the carved stone their only monument. One spring, a girl asked, "Miss Mira, are you married?" Ashen laughed. "Not in the way most folks understand. But you love each other? More than most married people ever do." Elias raised his mug in quiet agreement. And when the time came, many years later, under a twilight sky, they didn't part with drama. Ashen passed first, her head resting on Elias's chest, her fingers wrapped around one of his carvings. He followed days later, in the same bed, the same silence, holding her shawl. No procession, no priest. But the children, now grown, came anyway. They lined the porch, lit candles, sang her songs. And when they stood by the river, they touched the stone Elias had carved long ago. Elias and Ashen Mira. We found each other when the world had nothing left. Someone placed wildflowers at its base. Someone else whispered, "They built love with silence." And another added, "And the courage to stay." In a world rushing toward noise, there's something sacred in the quiet kind of love Elias and Ashen Mira built. They didn't need permission or perfection, just the choice to stay. And maybe that's the lesson we still need today. In a time when relationships are swiped past, when vows are often louder than actions, this story reminds us. Love is not measured in words, but in presence, in the way you show up, in the warmth of a shared cup, in the silence you choose not to leave. Elias never said "I love you" in so many words, but he built it in the soil, in the spoons, in every fire he lit for her. Ashen Mira didn't wear a ring, but she wore his name in the life they created together, one of meaning, memory, and quiet strength. So let me ask you, do you think love like this still has a place in our world? Is a life lived in silence somehow louder than one filled with noise? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Whether you're a grandparent who remembers a time when love was simple and steady, or someone still waiting for a kind of devotion that doesn't need to shout, I invite you to share. Have you ever experienced a quiet love, one that didn't come with ceremony, but stayed through every storm? And if this story touched something in you, if it made you think of someone, or even just made you feel a little less alone, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps keep stories like this alive, because some tales aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be remembered. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, may your love be steady and your silence full.